Hello and welcome to another episode of the Ancient Warfare Magazine podcast. My name is Jasper Orthuis. I'm the editor of Ancient Warfare Magazine, and with me are Murray Dahm, my assistant editor, Mark McCaffrey, Mark DeSantis, and Lindsay Powell. We're in between two regular issues, so we thought of a topic to amuse ourselves today, and we thought of what was the most influential weapon of the ancient world. And just to get us going, I thought I'd take a look at an interesting book about the very early history of warfare. And he makes the point that, a spear and a dagger and a bow and an axe are all tools or hunting weapons. That makes sense. But then when the mace comes in, that could potentially be our first evidence of warfare because once you're close enough to an animal to kill it or maybe to finish it off after you've taken it down with a bow and arrow, there's no need to have a mace because you already probably have an axe or you have a dagger to finish the job. There's no need to invent a special extra weapon. So his reasoning is but because a mace or essentially a further developed club was invented, that means that point there is actual warfare between very early tribes, societies. But the interesting is, so you could say that is a very, very influential weapon, but then it kind of disappears almost immediately. I think the Egyptians have clubs to some degree, but we come up with much more efficient weapons, or people come up with much more efficient weapons that are far more widely spread. So who would like to make a point for what would be the most influential weapon?
Well, I was gonna answer the mace thing would be that it depends on when does big game fishing start, because they use clubs to end the life of their catch, not a spear, not a sword, not a knife. So
Yeah, but in Anatolia, there's probably not very much big
no,
game
exactly.
fishing,
Who
and
could say?
that's
Yeah,
where.
yeah. I'm going to go. Look, I'm going to speak first. I'm going to say that the sarissa, the long double-handed pike of the Macedonian armies, is the most influential. That from 350 to 323, it conquers most of the known world in the Western Mediterranean as far as India, creates Alexander the Great's empire, which wipes all before it. And then obviously the Diadochi, the successors, fight amongst themselves for the next 200 years. Eventually they come into contact with Rome and defeated. But I think that one of the reasons for that is that the phalanx has stagnated by that point because they've only fought one another for generations. Whereas when it's introduced under Philip II, firstly, he defeats the Illyrians, he defeats the Paeonians, he defeats the Greeks. Then Alexander similarly defeats the Thracians and then conquers the Persian Empire. So that idea of the 16 rank deep phalanx armed with the sarissa is truly influential. And I think one of the things that happens, of course, is that also disappears for a long time and then comes back. We all remember Braveheart and the Schiltron, and whether that is in fact copied from the Macedonians, depending on whether you're Mel Gibson or a historian, depends on whether you agree with that or not. And then, of course, you do have the pike phalanxes coming back into very influential warfare with the 15th century and 16th century pike phalanxes in European warfare, which in many ways are actually influenced by the fact that the tactica manuals about the Macedonian phalanx and the Hellenistic phalanx get an idio princeps in the 15th century. They're then translated into various languages and they become influential and influence, the pike, the Swiss pikemen and these other pikes. So it's this bizarre circular repetition. We're probably due for another, the pike.
Maybe as a result of this episode.
Yeah, exactly. If you want one, yes, right here. So I think the sarissa for me is one of the most influential weapons of the ancient world. I would say the most influential, but I'm sure that the panel will disagree with
I'd
me.
challenge that definitely in terms of saying the sarissa, because once you sort of say the sarissa is the most influential, I've got a question. Was it the infantry of Alexander the Great that really won his battles, or was it the cavalry that won his battles? In which case,
Without the infantry, the cavalry couldn't do what they did.
and I'd say without the cavalry, the infantry couldn't do what they did as well. In which case, it's actually the Ziston that actually comes into being the most crucial weapon there.
If you look at all of Alexander's battles and Philip's battles, it's the infantry doing what it does that allows the cavalry to charge into a gap. Without the infantry, there wouldn't have been the anvil on which that hammer could have landed. What you get with Pyrrhus, of course, when he fights the phalanx, is that the infantry of Pyrrhus doesn't do what the infantry of Alexander did. But, that's why we still have a Pyrrhic victory. They're not being defeated. They are fighting strongly. But I think that without the phalanx, which is absolutely what Philip and Alexander are remembered for, not cavalry tactics, not cavalry strategy, they're remembered for the phalanx. And so I think without the phalanx, you couldn't have had what they did with their cavalry, which wasn't anything new.
In terms of the infantry, as he moves eastwards, is the Sarissa being used consistently? Because you've got more of an idea of the phalangites are not being used as the Sarissa wielding pike all the time. They are armed with other weapons consistently. And again, he has to adopt different tactics as he's moving eastwards and meeting different styles of enemies. So again, it's influential to start with. Whether it continues to be influential,
I think the flexibility of the phalangite is something that gets lost because all they end up fighting is other phalangites. But under Alexander, they are indeed flexible. I don't want to spoil for the next issue of the magazine, there's a famous duel between a phalangite and an Athenian that Alexander hosts. And that phalangite is armed with both a sarissa and a javelin. And he hurls his javelin first, which is avoided. And then he goes to attack him with his sarissa. So I think the flexibility of the phalangite is something we've lost. And there's a shortening of the sarissa when he goes into the mountains. But after Alexander's death, we go back to the long sarissid phalangite. So I think it absolutely is a phalangite, but they were flexible and did things, much like the decline of the Roman legions. They stopped being flexible. They stopped being able to adapt to different battlefield conditions, and they become stagnant. And they get defeated by a different style of warfare. So I think that's, again, a cyclical thing in warfare, that great innovative armies stagnate and get defeated by the next great.
I'm going with the gladius as the most influential weapon of the ancient world. And I'm lumping in all the various types of gladius that proceed from the example, the prototype found in Spain, possibly by Scipio Africanus during the Second Punic War. It includes the gladius hispaniensis, because gladius just means sword, but whenever anybody says gladius in a military historical context, they mean the short sword. The Mainz pattern gladius with the narrow waist and the long point, and the Pompey pattern, which had the straight edges and the shorter point, but all of them were optimized for stabbing. I think that with the gladius as we see it from the middle of Republican period, so roughly to the late 200 BC era to the early 3rd century, it was relatively stable. It won the Romans an empire. I mean, the empire was obviously enormously influential, socially, culturally, to. Also, I think that if you look at the gladius, and this is something the point has to be made about any weapon, it's never used in isolation from everything else that's going on in the battlefield. And the gladius was meant to be used with the Roman legionary wielding a large scutum, a shield. In the imperial period, it was squared off, rectangular, but convex shape. And what I believe is, to the extent that I can formulate in my mind how this would have been used, is that a legionary would have stood behind his shield with as much of his body covered as possible, and opportunistically struck at an opponent, whether with the point or with the slash with the edge, not risking himself overly much. I think that the key was maintain cohesion. I think that cohesion was the ultimate decider of battles, really, because eventually the side that lost cohesion, broke first and ran, and that's who lost the battles. So while the Roman general would never want to decrease his legionaries' aggressiveness, what did happen was that I think that they wanted them to preserve themselves and make sure that their own lines were not overrun. So if you consider that there was the scutum, the gladius, which were excellent in the sort of like a tactical tactical defense, but then could immediately go on to the offense too when necessary. I think that's how the gladius was employed. So my vote's for the gladius in all of its forms.
I think it's fascinating that Roman infantrymen identify themselves for a very long period of time as swordsmen, whereas there's a lot of, especially in popular media, they're spearmen. And, in movies, because of insurance and safety, there's very little throwing of pila. If you think about Gladiator, they walk into battle wielding like their spears, and you're like, no, those are for throwing. Throw them. And they don't throw them. In fact, the only film where they're throwing them willy-nilly is from 1936's Scipio Africanus, an Italian film, which looks like there was no concerns for safety because it was 1936. But it's interesting that the Roman, when you look at the tombstones, some of them aren't carrying their spears. It's the sword and the cingulum, the belt that they emphasize. And that's what makes them stand out. And so that's a fascinating identifier that it was the gladius. And obviously, when the Roman legions come against
the belt, really.
Yeah. Well, the belt, you get some who don't wear anything other than the belt. So there's no sword, there's a tunic and a belt. But
because then you can see you're a soldier. Because the punishment, there's a punishment where for light infractions where they're supposed to stand guard without their belt, like some lowly day wage laborer. So, a Roman soldier going out in his tunic with his tunic hitched up over his belt, that's a Roman soldier. So that's how they're depicted.
And again, the gladius is a separate entity in terms of the scabbard and whatnot to the actual cingulum, because the cingulum does not consistently get used as any function for holding a sword. That's out down to the balteus, which is a separate item for them.
But in terms of when the Roman legions come up against the phalanx with Pyrrhus onwards, the fact that they have a stabbing sword, whereas the trend in Hellenistic swords was to go for the kopis, which was a slashing sword. They sort of moved away from the xiphos, which was a shorter stabbing sword, and the gladius and the scutum was a better one-on-one weapon than the pelte and the kopis or the xiphos even.
Yeah, I don't think I wonder how much our understanding of the gladius is a result of popular media, because we tend to still think, gladius is a short sword. And before we started the recording, we were, of course, pre-chatting, and we were talking about medieval swords. And I think perhaps we tend to think of the gladius as a short sword in comparison to far longer medieval swords. Because, your average gladius is still, between 60 and 70 centimeters, I think.
Yeah. 45 centimeter blade. It's not short.
It's not really a short. I mean, certainly compared to the Greek swords, it's longer probably. And from descriptions, I think it's Livy has descriptions about battle against the Celts, maybe, where there's lots of lopped off limbs, and which shows that it's definitely not just for stabbing.
Yeah, I think it's interesting also that it's a shorter sword, but it's not a short sword. And then I think, again, which we'll probably get onto with one of the questions, when the spatha becomes, which starts as a cavalry sword and it's a barbarian sword that gets adapted, which is something to do with smelting, which we'll get to. But, it then gets adopted by infantry forces using spatha. And by the 5th century AD, everyone has a spatha. It's the sword, and it kind of develops into medieval swords.
Yeah, and on average, it's
60 centimeters. It's 15 centimeters longer.
It's just barely longer. Yeah,
I think we're missing something in translation, though, in terms of actually understanding. We're talking about short and long swords. I think it's more the character of the sword that actually is what the Romans identify, and it's that the whole, and I'm sort of coming around to the weapon that I was going to bring in was going to be the Pugio, and of course the Pugio is intimately connected in terms of its evolution with the gladius, both coming from the Iberian Peninsula originally, but they've both got this idea of that they are more about like punching weapons in terms of how they are being used, that they are brute force weapons. And I think that's important when you sort of think about the Romans identifying with the gladius and it being identified with them. It is something about the character that is being conveyed by the weapon, not just the style or the shape of the weapon. It's got more to it than that that's being said.
I think it's the Pugio. I think is very similar to the Akanakes in the Persian context in terms of length. We do get this sort of. I think Herodotus even starts talking about the Persian short sword and it being particularly short. And again, coming back to Jasper's point, when you compare the blade length of an Akanakes and the blade length of a Xiphos, not that much different, really.
Well, the Akanakes is 40 centimeters, roughly, give or take 5, in terms of...
Not short. Yeah. No. It's a bizarre thing to talk about a short sword that's quite long. And then, of course, the Spartans have very short swords. And there's an anecdote which, how am I meant to kill with this short sword? And the response is add a step to it. Like, oh, sorry. Yes,
Well, certainly it would appear that the Romans would step forward in order to make use of their gladius. They would step forward and with the shield, protected by the shield all the time. That is, which is why I say that when they were being aggressive, they were still being defensive in the sense that they were fighting from behind a shield. So that's how they actually got closer. And I think they did that opportunistically.
So I think Mark is right in the sense that what we're talking about here is it's hard to actually show the influence, which is the point of the question, right? And if I've got a definition of influence, it means the capacity to have an effect on the character, development, or behavior of someone or something, or the effect itself. Is the weapon on its own without the combat doctrine isn't actually terribly helpful. So what Mark described very eloquently was the way that, and as a reenactor was drilled in this, was literally the punch and stab. And it always irritates me, for example, when I see other reenactors when they're literally waving the gladius up here, or they somehow are holding the scutum up high. And this literally is, the gladius is up here. There are no depictions of that, as far as I can see.
Well, I come back to Jasper's point about you can't lop limbs off without waving it round above your head.
No, but the doctrine is this, is that, for example, the body armor of the Roman soldier emphasizes the protection to the exposed areas, right? When you do this, there's no armor under here. There's no armor below the knee.
That's maybe an addition to what Mark was saying, that it's certainly the interpretation of the late Republican early, and that goes especially with the Mainz sword, which is interesting, that the shape of the gladius changes so much. And the Mainz ones, I think the Mainz ones on average the shortest and the widest. That is the time that, the Roman legionary wears either the hamata with the doublet over the shoulders or the segmenta, which of course is reinforcements over the shoulders. You have the Weisenau or the Imperial Gallic type helmet with the very large neck area. So he's protected from strikes from above and slashes, and he has a large shield that he holds in front of him, which suggests that, I think it's Connolly, actually. Peter Connolly has written an academic article about this that suggests indeed that he is sort of fighting in a sort of semi-crouch, maybe. He's protected from above, he's protected in front by his shield, and he stabs around it with his gladius.
And that seems to be what we see on the Adam Cleese metopes. That is one classic depiction of a legionary who does look like he's in that sort of crouch with the sword, stabbing out midway from beside the shield. And in fact, since the scutum, which once again, it just means shield, but I'm talking about the legionary shield, it weighed over 14 pounds. That's a heavy piece of kit. So you have to imagine that they were doing something important with it to give him that heavy an item. And in addition, the hand grip was parallel to the ground so that the legionary could punch out with it by extending his arm, as opposed to the way the Greek the hoplite shield was held, which was more akin to how we would think a medieval shield would be held, around the elbow.
You've got
right?
the porpax, the porpax and the hand
Right.
grip on the outside. Yeah.
So the legionary scutum can actually be used to punch more readily, though quite frankly it must have been tiring, because 14 pounds extended outward must have been something.
But again, to your point though, Mark, I mean, there's also the Mainz inscriptions, which actually again showed this kind of crouching. And when we at the Elm Street Guard would do this, I mean, you train, as far as training goes, with a wicker shield, which really buggers your hand in, I can tell you. But the point is, this idea of these things being heavier in the practice drill hall rather than the actual one. So all these things are very interesting, but also the scutum itself evolved in shapes, right? It didn't stay a rectangle. In fact, that was kind of a transitory shape as well. So I think really it's interesting that when you look at the influence of an individual piece, it must be set within the context of the rest of the panoply, and of course the enemy that you're fighting. And sort of my anti-point to the Sarissa is it wasn't on the battlefield very long, was it? So I think the acid test of the influence of a weapon is how long it's been around, which is my way of introducing the spear.
Well, if we're doing that, then it has to be chainmail. But
it's not a weapon. I mean, the scutum, you could say.
I think I was going to say one to point to. I'm glad that Mark brought up the Adam Glissy monuments, because there's one of those, and again, the idea of that crouching protected, the manica on the right arm is obviously about that. And now that the best preserved version of the manica is not from a Dacian campaign sense, which is where we normally associate it with, it's from Teutoburg. So it's like, it's earlier and not for, the Dacian Sika or Falk's weapon that was originally, this is why it was devised. And it's like, no, it was earlier. Any wild barbarian with a slashing sword, you need your arm protected, which is true enough. But there's a one of those metopes shows a legionary stabbing down into the shoulder of a German with a Swabian knot. And the grip is that. He's stabbing downwards with the sword here, which is a very peculiar one, because
listeners
draw
can't
the
see,
sword,
but
it should
Murray's
be this way. Yeah. If you're listening to this, it's very confusing.
Means the sword's pointing downward.
It's essentially an underhand grip that he's taken it out of his scabbard naturally rather than reversed, and has immediately stabbed, as opposed to.
No, what he did was, in fact, he did like a gladiator move, which is he spun it around in his hand like you do with a pistol. And it was, yes. I could do it with my letter.
The gladius is the originator of the six-shooter. There you go.
Yeah, good. But I was going to make the point, if I can explain, what I'm finding fascinating is the variety of weapons here. But I think the granddaddy of all weapons was the humble spear. And I'm looking at a picture, which actually is one that's 400,000 years old. It's the oldest wooden artifact in the world, and it was found in Germany, in Schöningen. And it's obviously a hominid weapon, so it's a very distant relative of humankind. But what I find interesting is that in terms of influence, surely that is the weapon which has had most impact on humankind, not only the ancient warfare battlefield, because it may have started off as a hunting weapon, in obvious reasons, because it puts some distance between you and the prey. You can throw this, you can stab, and so on. And man was working in groups pretty much at that time. But as you turn it into a battlefield weapon, you then replace the pointy end of the stick, literally, and you supplement it with flint, and you supplement it then eventually with copper and bronze and iron. And all through human civilization, the spear has been there in different lengths and different styles of blade. But it's just amazing to me that it's such a simple economical weapon. It can be deployed across an army at relative speed, as long as you've got one armorer who can actually hammer out the metal piece of it. It can be jammed on the end of a stick, and you're ready to go to battle. And it goes all the way through the ancient world, all the way through to the late antiquity, and it's still being used on the medieval battlefield. So I think in terms of influence, that's the weapon that should be front and center of our discussion. And I'm just going to leave this image. It's interesting to me that the typical Roman symbol of victory was the trophy, the tropaia. And typically this was a wooden tree stump with the hanging armor of the fallen general on the other side, and typically crossed spears. And these were hung at the back or at the front or on the sides, and it was almost emblematic. These were the trophy items. The armor was for defense, but the spears were for combat.
I think it's also influenced that the spear is, again, when you talk about how did the hoplite identify themselves, they were given a helmet, a shield, and a dory. And it was the dory that identified the hoplite. And Aeschylus, lots of other authors talk about the dory versus the sagitta. So you have the dory of the Greek warrior versus the arrow of the Persian warrior. And later you get the pila versus the sagitta against the Sassanid Persians. But it's interesting because, well, hang on, but the Persians also had spears. And we talk about the long hoplite spear versus the short Persian spear, and you're like, they're the same length. They're, when you look at the Persepolis monuments, and like that's the same height as a we're always plagued by the fact that no shafts survive in this context, just blades. But you're like, but when we look at artistic depictions, they're the same length of spear. So hang on, and why isn't the Persian spearman, who's called a spearman, why isn't he a spearman? Why is he an archer? And obviously the Persians have this interesting combination that all of their spearmen also carry goritos bow cases. So they've got bows and spears. So they are both archers and spearmen when needed. And they have the akanakes as well. So they're kind of doing all three. And then, of course, obviously you've got the difference between a hasta and a pilum in Roman context, because I think one of the things that's interesting about a spear being a throwing weapon versus a spear being a thrusting weapon. And I was looking recently at the Samnite frescoes. None of them have swords. They do not wear swords in any of those frescoes, just spears. It's like, well, you're not throwing that. I'm completely unarmed. So that idea of a spear is also quite versatile, because yes, you can throw it, but you can also keep it and thrust with it and even defend with it, as we've seen in many.
Well, to that very subject, I remember watching a group of German reenactors, and one of the things that they demonstrated very effectively is the way that you can use a spear. You basically lock it into your armpit, and you swing it round like a scythe. And you can imagine if you're in a close quarters combat, that you've got the distance that the spear imposes, but instead, rather than stabbing, you chop away at their legs, and I thought that was an innovative way of using
But
it.
isn't that very similar to the over the top of the scutum gladius strike? You're like, hang on a minute, where are you getting that from? I mean, the things you can do with a spear and with any weapon are not necessarily the things that.
Well, no, but
done.
you could think. I mean, we think of a spear as a pokey device, but a lot of the sort of generic spear blades are fairly long, and if their edges are sharp, then what
They're
Lindsay
cutting
suggests
weapon,
is
yeah.
is definitely an option.
Yeah. I was going to make the other point to Lindsay's point about the cross spears with the tropaeum is that one of the awards, obviously, for a Roman's bravery is the pure spear, the hasta pura, which is a spear without a blade, which is
A pointy stick, in fact.
no, an unpointy stick, a quarterstaff even, or a bow if you're going to be Japanese. Okay. So I think it's an interesting one, and I was going to bring up with Mark's idea of the evolution of the scutum. I've read somewhere the idea of the oval scutum, the original Celtic shape that gets adopted because of the curved edge. It's easier to thrust under and over in comparison to the curved rectangular, which doesn't have that advantage. You've got to expose more of your body to strike behind that shield. And the rectangular scutum doesn't last very long. It's a bit like the sarissa, that really it's only got 150 years of service. And then it's replaced by oval shields again. which again have this idea, even though the sword by that point has become longer, it does still seem in Roman infantry terms to be used mainly in a thrusting capacity, even though it's now become more
Although,
Spatha-esque.
yeah, that shield is oval in shape, but no longer dished, or well, I think
Well, the
opinions seem to
arguments about
differ.
whether they're curved.
Yeah,
Yeah. I mean, the Arch of Constantine, they seem to still be dished, but then by some of the survivals of boards, they're
yeah,
flat. And then, of course,
they
obviously, you
seem
get the
flat.
migration era spear. Sorry, what are we talking about? Shields, Murray. And so they are now flat and round, and that obviously goes into the Viking era and beyond. But their handhold is a vertical rather than a horizontal handhold. So, and obviously, you can't keep that
But it's
punched
interesting
out.
to go back that scutum originates in a period when the gladius hispaniensis is not yet around, and the Romans compete with other Italian peoples, possibly with javelins and early pila.
Yeah, or the the lovely Celtic iron swords that bend and hit someone on the head and it bends around the shape of their head. So you have to straighten it out on the battlefield, which is just the most hilariously non-combat like looking image. Like, oh, I bent my sword. Hang on, oh, right, ready to go.
Yeah, but maybe
Which
if
is
your sword is very, I was just going to give a segue to Mark. If your sword is so bent, you might need something else to take a stab with.
That's it. I would actually argue otherwise. I've got to say. I mean, the sorry to shoot you down there, Jasper.
I was
Um,
just trying to give it to you.
yeah, Pugio. I've got to say, I mean, something like this is, you'd think is going to be your nice backup weapon. But I mean, it's
Just again, for people
you
who are
look.
listening, Mark is trying to intimidate us with a Pugio.
with
Sorry.
an actual
Yeah.
replica Poogie.
Oh, sorry. I bring toys with me. In terms of the Pugio, I mean, it's as I said before, it's more about the mentality that it comes with. It, one, it's very limited in the time that it's actually documented to be using. Yes, it comes in with the gladius sometime possibly in the 3rd century, possibly around about the time of the Second Punic War. But on the other hand, it's something that doesn't seem to make I mean, you see it and you hear about it being the backup weapon that is the standard of the legionary. But when you actually look at the evidence for it, actually the evidence is very limited to mainly the western half of the empire, mainly limited to soldiers who had served in either Gaul or in the Iberian Peninsula, where they seem to actually be coming from. But then again, it's not always seen as something that is in action. It's there to be used. And the really weird thing is that the Romans don't even themselves seem to consider it a weapon. Rather, it's just part of their kit. I mean, you get Corbulo punishing a soldier for digging a trench without weapons, yet he's got a Pugio on. So in that case, what is it? It's, you have people like Caesar, and you've also got the same sort of thing happens in the civil wars of 69 with the Batavian attack on a Roman legion, that the Pugio can be used in close combat. Throw away the pilum, throw away the gladius. We're going in, and it's going to be just the Pugio and really hard, close action. But then on the other hand, it's actually more documented when it comes into, funnily enough, out of the military sphere and into the more domestic sphere of politics, and you have it as the weapon par excellence of assassinations, and of course the most famous one of all, Gaius Julius Caesar. And it is more an instrument, and I think instrument is a better word for it than weapon, of Roman force, be it on the military battleground or in the setting of the Senate and the knives of the Senate as such. It is a weapon that says something, or a tool that says something greatly about the Roman image, the Roman psyche, and I think that's why it's influential. It's
And to
slightly
that
in a
very
different
point,
class to what's been mentioned.
to that very point, to back up your point there, what's fascinating to me, and I've been looking at examples just recently about blinged out dagger scabbards. I mean, with the the enamels and the various precious metals laid in there, so clearly Roman soldiers were prepared to fork out some serious cash to have these types of things, and they must have looked very, very showy as people worked out. To take a
Well,
further point back,
you're saying, the example I've got here is like very basic, it's based on an earlier thing. But yes, as you go into the imperial period, the ones that do come to light, especially in the archaeology, amazing hilts to them. So
I like the very technical term of blinged out. I look forward to reading that in archaeological and historical
I'll put it
academics.
in my next
I think
article.
it's very fair for
Absolutely,
especially
absolutely, it
early imperial
absolutely is.
soldiers.
But I think if you wrote that in a 19th century academic article, people would not understand what blinged out
No,
meant.
but if you find a good German translation, it would be fine.
Yeah, I pride myself on using wannabe in an academic article in 2001, copying the
So
Spice
could you have
Girls.
he was a like a wannabe blinged out legionary or something?
Yeah, exactly.
But speaking of actually of the archaeology, what is interesting is that there are very few Republican examples, I think. There are loads of, I mean, actually fairly large numbers of, Julio-Claudian examples. And then it
yeah, but
tapers off
again, they're
very
in
quickly.
Europe. It's predominantly Europe, and it's very rare that you can get these things going into the East. And I mean, I've got a map somewhere to actually showing all the find spots as of
I think,
the
I
last
think
20, 30
most were
years, and
found.
it's
Yeah,
tiny.
most were found in Pompeii and Mainz.
Right, but with the eruption possibly having been the reason why so many specimens of the Pompeii pattern were found there. That doesn't mean that it was only used in that area, but it happened to be like crystallize a time capsule of like everything else at Pompeii of that weapon. Now, and interestingly enough, they find many of these weapons in rivers because they think that the weapons were being disposed of as part of some sort of religious ritual.
I'll tell you something that interesting that, Mark, because as a reenactor, what I found was the Pugio. I mean, a lot of them are actually not properly dimensioned because they're actually, I think, much thinner than the real ones are. It's typically in a metal scabbard, and the thing can bounce around. It literally can jump up and down, and it's quite possible as you're wading through and moving at speed, these things can fall out. And that's my kind of go-to explanation of why you find these things. And I was looking at the examples that were found recently in the Alps, and they think they're connected with the Alpine War of 15 BC. And there were people scrambling over rocks and all sorts of things just to get through the mountain passes. So they would probably drop them.
I think the same goes for several specimens of helmets, right? I mean, that they found helmets in rivers and things like that.
Well, there's that famous Boeotian helmet in the Tigris, which they think was lost by one of Alexander's cavalrymen as he crossed the river. But they weren't attacked, so it's like, well, that was clearly an un-enemy accident. But imagine if you'd blinged out your Pugio and you lost it in a river. Oh, it'd be like losing your mobile phone.
Mind you, it goes to actually supports the argument of that that you're to use your phrase, blinging. That in terms of a lot of them being worn in a very horizontal fashion, we're seeing in some of the depictions on grave stela and everything. So it's actually to say
the one that
lost and also, right, on the one hand, but at the other hand, it is being worn as a fashion item.
Yeah, I was just thinking then that the interesting thing about the Dacian Wars, coming back to the Pugio not being a weapon, but being a symbol of status somehow, the short seeker blade, which seemingly everyone wore, and we have in the archaeological record, is also not shown as a weapon, but it is a status symbol, and they also bling out there. And they also have metal scabbards, interestingly, the short seeker blades. They're not the sword ones that you see, or the double-handed falcos that you see on.
And to add to that, the Akanaka as well has a metal scabbard that we hear about.
So the short dagger / short sword status symbol does seem to be something that various military cultures have as an identifier. Certainly, we've talked about the military belt being the real identifier, but sort of like, yeah, but the one that you take the most pride in. I mean, are there any blinged out belts? We've clearly adopted and adapted
Oh,
the word
goodness,
bling.
Oh,
yes.
yeah.
Yeah,
I
but I
mean,
mean, above and beyond what would be standard, as in,
Oh,
yeah,
yeah,
there was, I think
personal.
hundreds of patterns,
Okay.
hundreds of different patterns.
there's
Yeah, no,
lots of
but
patterns, and I think there are patterns
pattern and
also with
blinking.
inlay.
Yeah, blinging
And
out your own personal copy as opposed to a system. Like if you find a very decorated pattern that is repeated across several belts, that's not the same as an individual taking their belt and blinging it out.
Well, the
That's
ones I
a
recognize, so for example, some of them will be like a square panel with slightly raised edges. They've got 4 points where you rivet them into the leather. And they have like a raised, it's like a large rosette type of shape, if you will. That's one type. Another type will be much more like, I'm going to sort of say, almost shrunk down playing cards. I mean, they've got beautiful consistent symmetrical patterning on the inside. And there's all sorts of variations. And I mean, of course, they're handcrafted. So I mean, again, I think what this points to is the degree to which we've had this in other conversations is uniformity is a modern idea, and in fact, we would be really struck by the diversity of material, and of course, a lot of it's going to be handed down, presumably, from one soldier to whoever takes over from them. So there's going to be a mix of older stuff and new stuff and innovative stuff and repaired stuff.
And you've also got the fact that, I mean, taking, for example, Gladii, the sword is very recognizable as an individual item. The incident with Caesar up in amongst the Belgae, I think it is, when he is shown what is supposedly one of his old swords, which has been found on the battlefield and has been claimed by the local tribe and put up as a trophy. And he tells them to leave it there, let them have their little moment. But again, it's there's the inference that it's a recognizable individual sword.
It's
So,
also interesting that you talk about that because, of course, the sword and the stone, and there are several examples of actual. So I think one was stolen recently in France or Belgium, like that's been there since the medieval period. But even going back into the ancient world, you've got the sword of Mars. The story of Attila is the same thing. It's a sword that's discovered. Is it a river? I think it might be in a river when it's found. But anyway, that's fascinating in terms of all of that symbolism of the weapon. But also, isn't there an anecdote of Caesar chastising his men for decorating their shields and equipment, and that they're trusting more in gold and silver than they are in the use of it, and that the several, I think Sertorius is another. They basically want their equipment of their soldiers to be undecorated to show that it's a usable item, not an
yeah,
unusable
well,
item, which is
it might say something about the legionaries' faith in their paymasters.
yeah, carry portable wealth. But also that idea, a lot of these shields, especially the ones found in Britain that are highly decorative, one of the things that we always get about that, the same is said of the Dura Europa scutum. Oh, it's decorative. It's clearly was never
Yeah,
intended
but I
for
mean, we were
use.
just talking about scabbards. If you look at indeed like the gladii, how many variants there are and varieties there are in the grips made out of all kinds of materials and shapes and decorations, and the scabbards have lots of different patterns on them, and I'm sure that they are very likely the legionaries, might be issued with you know, standard pattern or this one that came from the stores and then they bought a nicer one later, put their own money because they liked it better and because it's
Yeah,
portable wealth.
yeah, or they had their best sword and their usable, their everyday sword possible as well. I mean, but in terms of those, the shields, the Battersea and all these other shields that were found in the rivers, especially in the Thames, and the usual argument is, oh, this was a dedication, not lost in a river crossing. This was not used in combat. I mean, the Pocklington shield, which was found, 2017, I think, which is a highly decorated shield with battle damage in it. You're like, well, this is a highly decorated shield, clearly got stabbed at some point. So I think the idea that you wouldn't use a highly decorated shield is less valid. I think absolutely you're going to bling yourself out on the battlefield. Blinged out on the battlefield. That's it. They're all rappers. That's what they all are. They're all They're pimping their rides.
Well, yeah, but they all do. I mean, the auspice is, but nobody thinks of
Yeah,
an auspice
absolutely.
well,
Absolutely.
apart from maybe for Spartans, but then
My favorite is the fly, the hoplite who had a painting of a fly, a actual scale fly on his shield, so that you would see it up close. Oh, nice.
if you can see this, I am too close
Yeah,
to
yeah,
you.
yeah, yeah. Objects in your rearview mirror. Absolutely. Now, we've got some questions to
We
answer.
do, we do. Most of them are not strictly related to this topic, so maybe we should save them for another time. But there is one that it does really impact on what we were just discussing, and that is, if the gladius is so influential and so important to the Romans, how come apparently nobody else used them? The Romans copy everything from everyone. Why
Because
do?
I think that the basic idea is the doctrine. It's the combat doctrine, and Mark described it with the crouching and the shield and fighting as a unit, a contubernum, or whatever it is. And it's effective in that context. If you take it outside of that, I don't know that the gladius is terribly good for dueling. It's too short. Plus, the blade gets hacked about pretty quickly because it's a double-edged, straight-edged weapon mostly. Other armies are not fighting like that. Maybe the Catti, perhaps, because they were trained, but
The short sword did enjoy something of a renaissance during the Renaissance when the sword and bucklerman, the short sword, was used by the infantry who were fighting inside the tercio. So when the press of pikes came up against each other and there was no room to maneuver, the only people who could get about to go stab were these relatively lightly armed, small shields, but short sword men. So that's why I think that building on the whole idea of what's the armaments package that we're talking about, that is, the short sword made sense in a certain context. So if you are in a really tight scrum, let's call it, not much room to maneuver, it mattered. It was effective. Same thing happened with the Romans. Now, presumably, just to build upon, where did the gladius go after, say, the 3rd century? Why was it replaced by the spada, which really just, to my mind, looked like a long gladius? It could be because it was not possible for Roman legionaries of the later empire to maintain that sort of cohesion or discipline the same way that legionaries of the middle or early imperial period were. I don't know. That's a supposition, and I'll leave it at that.
I was actually going to say that I'm pretty sure that gladii have been found in Scandinavia.
I was going to point out that the interesting thing about a lot of these weapons, and as a general warrior mindset, is even when a weapon has been superseded and there are better options, a lot of warriors will stick with what they not just know, but with the status symbol weapon. Because, I'm thinking General Patton with his pearl-handled six-shooters during World War II, or, others who kept a flintlock musket because it's handed down from grandfather and decorated, into the 20th century, the Rift Wars. There's, what would be very valuable antiques being used on the battlefield. And so those sorts of ideas of elongating of a career of a weapon perhaps has a status attached to it, that you use these things for a lot longer than they are in fact practicable because of that. And I think that's when you see the spatha beginning to come in as an infantry weapon. It's a transitional period, and there are those who hold on to the gladius for a lot longer, and then, as you say, it's very difficult to tell the difference between a long spatha, which seems to be straight edged, and then the migration period swords, which are still similar length, but the blades taper. And there's obviously hundreds of examples of migration period weapons.
There was also the semi-spatha, which in the late
Yeah.
imperial period was sort of like a halfway, almost like the gladius returned or something akin to that. So I'm sure that they used whatever was effective for whatever reason.
And it's always useful to mention that we stick labels on everything.
To your point, Jasper, the things that have been found in Scandinavia a lot are Roman daggers.
Yeah, there you go.
And
Well,
they seem to be
status symbol.
partly trade items, or unless they were actually troops returning, and then they just got passed further and further into the northern country.
In terms of status, you've also got the likes of Hadrian, famously arming himself with the spatha because it's his personal preference. So, and again, that probably feeds in a little bit in terms of, hero worship of, I'm going to be like the big man with the spatha. Just like any other period in terms of a trend taking hold, be it the beard of Hadrian or the sideburns of Nero.
On that bombshell, the sideburns of Nero. I couldn't think of anything better. Thank you all, and we'll see you again soon.